Zach Miller was a craftsman by trade and an artist by passion. For years, he had made a modest living restoring antique furniture and creating bespoke wooden designs for those who appreciated the beauty of handcrafted work. His hands, rough from years of sanding, carving, and staining, were his most valuable tools, and every piece he worked on carried a bit of his soul. When his grandmother passed away, she left him something that no amount of money could ever replace: her house. The Victorian home, with its steep gables, ornate trim, and a wraparound porch, stood as a testament to a bygone era of craftsmanship. It was a house where every detail, from the carved balusters on the staircase to the intricate molding along the ceilings, spoke of a time when homes were built with care and personality. For Zach, it was more than just a home. It was a piece of family history, a place filled with memories of holiday dinners, summer afternoons on the porch swing, and his grandmother's laughter echoing through the hallways. The house had seen better days, with peeling paint and sagging eaves, but Zach didn't mind. It was his now, and he intended to restore it to its former glory. The neighborhood, however, had changed dramatically since Zach was a child. What was once a quiet street of unique homes and friendly neighbors had become a battleground for modernization. Over the years, a homeowners group had taken root, led by the domineering and self-righteous Karen Bishop. Karen, a woman with an unshakable belief in her own authority, had worked tirelessly to impose her vision of uniformity on the area. Brightly painted Victorians were now beige boxes with identical front lawns. Flowering shrubs had been replaced with gravel and drought-resistant plants to maintain aesthetic standards. The houses still looked like homes, but their soul was gone. Zach's grandmother had resisted Karen's attempts to bring her under control, refusing to join the group or abide by its ever-growing list of arbitrary rules. She had remained fiercely independent, a trait Zach admired. It was no surprise, then, that Zach inherited not only her house but also her reputation as a difficult neighbor. Karen had barely waited a week after the funeral to approach Zach, clipboard in hand, to discuss necessary changes to bring the house into alignment with neighborhood guidelines. Zach had listened politely but made it clear that he had no intention of altering anything that didn't need fixing. From the moment he refused, Karen became a fixture in his life. She began her campaign subtly at first, stopping by to offer unsolicited advice about paint colors or landscaping options, always with the thinly veiled threat of consequences if he didn't comply. Zach ignored her, focusing instead on his restoration work. He had already spent countless hours removing old wallpaper to reveal original wood paneling beneath, repairing the sagging porch, and cataloging the rare, hand-carved moldings he intended to restore. The house was a labor of love, and every time Zach uncovered a hidden detail, a carved floral motif beneath layers of paint, a forgotten piece of stained glass in an attic window, he felt closer to his grandmother and the craftsman who had originally built the house. It was as if the house itself was rewarding his efforts to save it. But for every step forward, Karen seemed determined to pull him back. One afternoon, Zach noticed Karen standing on the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, staring at his house with narrowed eyes. She didn't approach him this time, but her expression was enough to put him on edge. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was planning something, but he had no idea what. Later that evening, as he sanded down a doorframe in the living room, his phone buzzed. It was an email from Karen. The subject line read, "Immediate action required." Zach opened it, skimming through paragraphs of legalese that accused him of everything from creating an eyesore to devaluing the neighborhood. Attached was a list of mandatory corrections, which included removing the unsightly original wood paneling he had painstakingly uncovered and repainting the house in an approved neutral tone. The message ended with a warning failure to comply would result in escalation. Frustrated but unwilling to let Karen derail his plans, Zach dismissed the email and went back to work. The house was his, and no one was going to tell him how to care for it. But Karen wasn't someone who took no for an answer. A few days later, Zach returned from running errands to find her waiting for him on his porch. "We need to talk," she said, her tone clipped and businesslike. Zach crossed his arms, leaning against the porch railing. "I don't think we do," he replied. Karen's smile didn't reach her eyes. "You've ignored my emails, which is unfortunate. I don't think you understand how serious this is. If you don't address these issues, we'll have no choice but to escalate. And I don't think you understand that this house doesn't fall under your authority, Zach shot back. It's private property, and I'll manage it however I see fit. Karen's mask of civility cracked, just for a moment. I've dealt with your kind before, she said, her voice low. You think you're above the rules, but you'll find out soon enough that this neighborhood doesn't tolerate that kind of arrogance. With that, she turned on her heel and marched down the steps, her clipboard clutched tightly in one hand. Zach watched her go, a sinking feeling settling in his gut. It wasn't just the words she'd said, it was the way she'd said them, as if she'd already won. He knew then that Karen wasn't going to stop until she got what she wanted, and she wasn't above playing dirty to get it. A week after Zach's tense encounter with Karen, he was starting to feel like he'd found his rhythm again. The restoration work was challenging but deeply satisfying. Every evening he'd step back and admire the progress he was making, the freshly repaired porch railing, the intricate wood paneling in the dining room that he had spent hours cleaning and treating. It felt like he was breathing new life into a part of his family's history. Karen's threats still lingered in the back of his mind, but he tried not to dwell on them. He figured her bark was worse than her bite. After all, what could she really do? That question was answered early one morning when Zach returned from a trip to the hardware store. As he approached his house, something felt wrong. He parked his truck in the driveway and stared at the front of his home, trying to put his finger on what had changed. Then it hit him. The windows on the right side of the house were completely gone. Not just the glass panes, everything. The window frames, the trim, even parts of the wall surrounding them had been stripped away, leaving a gaping hole that exposed the living room to the elements. Heart pounding, Zach jumped out of the truck and rushed to the porch. The damage was even worse up close. The intricate wood paneling in the living room, the same paneling he had spent weeks restoring, was shattered and scattered across the floor. Dust and debris covered everything. His tools, which he had left neatly organized on a workbench, were buried under piles of splintered wood and drywall. Zach's mind raced as he stepped through the open wall into his own home. Who had done this? Then he saw the note. It was taped to the remains of the door frame, written in neat, formal handwriting on expensive stationery. For your safety, these renovations were deemed necessary. You're welcome. Zach crumpled the note in his hand, rage bubbling to the surface. This wasn't a random act of vandalism. This was deliberate. And there was only one person who would have the audacity to do something like this, Karen. He stormed outside, scanning the street for any sign of her, but it was empty. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the breeze and the faint hum of a lawnmower a few houses down. Zach's hands trembled as he pulled out his phone and dialed the police. By the time the officers arrived, Zach had started cleaning up the mess, carefully gathering the shattered pieces of wood paneling in the hopes that he could salvage some of it. He explained the situation to the officers, showing them the note and the damage. They took photos and wrote a report, but their response wasn't exactly encouraging. Do you have any proof that Karen Bishop is behind this? One of the officers asked. Zach clenched his jaw. I don't have video footage, if that's what you mean. But who else would do this? She's been harassing me for weeks about the house. The officer sighed, flipping his notebook shut. We'll look into it, but without concrete evidence, there's not much we can do. You might want to consider installing cameras around the property, just in case something like this happens again. It wasn't the answer Zach wanted to hear, but he thanked them anyway, and watched as they drove off. He stood in the driveway for a long moment, staring at the gaping hole in his house. Karen had crossed a line. This wasn't just about annoying emails or passive-aggressive comments. This was an attack on his home, his property, and everything he had worked for. He spent the rest of the day boarding up the hole with plywood and cleaning up the debris. As he worked, his anger simmered just beneath the surface, fueling his determination. Karen thought she could bully him into submission, but she had underestimated him. If she wanted a fight, she was going to get one. The next morning, Zach decided to confront Karen directly. He walked down the street to her house, a pristine beige monstrosity that looked like it had been plucked straight out of a cookie-cutter suburb. The lawn was perfectly manicured, the hedges trimmed into geometric shapes, and a stone pathway led to the front door. Zach rang the doorbell, his jaw tight with frustration. Karen opened the door, her expression morphing from feigned surprise to smug satisfaction in an instant. "Oh, Zach," she said, her voice dripping with faux concern. "What brings you here so early?" "You know damn well why I'm here," Zach snapped. "What the hell were you thinking, sending people to tear apart my house?" Karen raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb," Zach shot back. He held up the note. "This was left on my property after someone destroyed my living room. The handwriting matches the notes you've sent me before." Karen's lips curled into a smile. "I have no control over what happens to a house that's in such obvious disrepair. Perhaps someone was just trying to help." "Help?" Zach's voice rose. "You've crossed the line, Karen. This is my home, and you had no right." Karen cut him off, her tone suddenly icy. "Your home is a hazard, Zach. It's bringing down the entire neighborhood. If you'd bothered to follow the guidelines like everyone else, none of this would have happened." Zach's fists clenched at his sides. "You're insane if you think I'm going to let you get away with this." Karen stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I don't think you understand how things work around here. I have the support of this entire neighborhood. You're just a stubborn little man clinging to a decrepit house that doesn't belong here anymore. You can either fall in line or get out of the way." For a moment, Zach was speechless. The audacity, the sheer arrogance of this woman was staggering. But as he turned and walked away, her words echoed in his mind. Fall in line or get out of the way. Back at his house, Zach called a lawyer. He explained the situation in detail, from Karen's harassment to the destruction of his property. The lawyer listened carefully, asking pointed questions and taking notes. By the end of the call, Zach felt a small glimmer of hope. He wasn't alone in this fight anymore. But the battle was just beginning. Over the next few days, Zach started noticing strange things happening around his property. Contractors he hadn't hired showed up claiming they were there to finish the job. Someone dumped a pile of gravel in his driveway, blocking his truck. And late one night he heard the sound of hammering and voices outside, but by the time he got outside to investigate, the intruders were gone. It was clear that Karen wasn't going to stop until she got what she wanted, but Zach wasn't going to roll over and let her win. This was his home, his family's legacy, and he would do whatever it took to protect it. Zach's lawyer, a sharp and experienced litigator named Evelyn Grant, wasted no time diving into the case. After hearing Zach's account of the destruction, the note, and Karen's escalating harassment, she advised him to begin meticulously documenting every incident, no matter how small. Evelyn's voice was firm as she laid out her approach over the phone. People like Karen thrive on intimidation and plausible deniability. If we're going to hold her accountable, we'll need a rock-solid case built on evidence, dates, photos, witnesses, everything. No more assumptions. We're going to nail her with facts. Zach took her advice to heart. He installed security cameras around his house the very next day, making sure they covered every vulnerable angle, especially the driveway and the parts of his property where Karen's contractors had done the most damage. The cameras gave him a small sense of control, but the tension in the neighborhood was palpable. Zach's frustration with Karen was beginning to consume him, and her smug, unbothered demeanor every time he saw her walking her dog or chatting with neighbors only fueled his anger. It didn't take long for the cameras to catch something. A few nights after they were installed, Zach woke to a notification on his phone. The motion detectors had been triggered in his backyard. He quickly opened the app linked to the cameras and saw two figures in hooded sweatshirts standing near his back fence, shining flashlights toward his house. One of them appeared to be taking notes on a clipboard, while the other was measuring something along the ground. Zach's heart raced as he watched them. This wasn't random trespassing, these people were calculating something. Before he could call the police, the two intruders climbed back over the fence and disappeared into the darkness. The next morning, Zach reviewed the footage and sent it to Evelyn. Her response was swift. "This is harassment, plain and simple," she said. "They're testing your boundaries, trying to scare you into backing down. But what's more important is why. They're not just doing this to be annoying. They have a goal, and we need to figure out what it is." Zach's anger boiled over as he stared at the spot where the strangers had been. He didn't need to think too hard about who might have sent them. Karen had taken her game to a new level. That day, Zach decided he'd had enough. He wasn't going to let her intimidate him into giving up his home or his plans for its restoration. He called a contractor to come out and assess the damage done to the living room walls and the surrounding structure. He needed a full report on how much it would cost to fix the destruction Karen's helpers had caused. When the contractor arrived, Zach was hopeful, but his optimism quickly faded as the man inspected the damage. "This isn't just cosmetic," the contractor said, frowning as he ran his hand along a cracked beam. "They hit some of the support structures. You've got a load-bearing wall here that's been compromised. You're lucky the whole thing didn't collapse. This is going to take serious work to repair, and it's not going to be cheap." Zach felt his stomach drop as the contractor rattled off a ballpark estimate. The cost was staggering, far more than Zach could afford on his own. He felt a deep sense of betrayal. Not just because of Karen's actions, but because of the systemic indifference he'd faced from the police and his neighbors. No one seemed to care that his home was being systematically destroyed. It felt like he was fighting this battle alone, with no end in sight. The next day, as Zach reviewed the contractor's report and began piecing together his next steps, a delivery truck pulled up in front of his house. Zach hadn't ordered anything, so he watched with confusion as the driver unloaded a large pallet of construction materials onto his driveway. He walked outside to confront the driver, but the man simply handed him a receipt and left. The materials were billed to Zach's name, with no indication of who had placed the order. It didn't take long for Zach to connect the dots. Karen was behind this, trying to create more chaos and confusion in his life. He called Evelyn, explaining what had happened. "This isn't just harassment anymore," Evelyn said. "She's actively trying to sabotage you. We need to escalate our response." Following Evelyn's advice, Zach filed a formal restraining order against Karen, citing her harassment, trespassing, and the financial and emotional distress she had caused. Evelyn made sure the paperwork was airtight, including the video footage, the contractor's report, and the delivery receipt as evidence. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. At the very least, it would send a clear message that Zach wasn't backing down. But Karen wasn't fazed. The very next day, Zach received another surprise and official-looking letter from a local inspection agency stating that his property was under review for multiple code violations. According to the letter, his restoration work was unlicensed and posed a safety hazard to the neighborhood. Zach was furious. This was Karen's work, he was sure of it. She was using her connections to weaponize the bureaucracy against him, turning what should have been a straightforward restoration project into a nightmare of red tape and legal threats. Determined to fight back, Zach decided to dig deeper into Karen's motives. Why was she so determined to make his life miserable? What did she stand to gain? He started talking to other neighbors, hoping to find someone who had dealt with Karen's overreach before. Most people were reluctant to speak out, afraid of becoming her next target, but one older man named Victor finally opened up. Victor had lived in the neighborhood for decades, long before Karen had moved in. He told Zach about her pattern of behavior, how she had systematically targeted anyone who didn't fall in line with her vision for the neighborhood. "She's not just a control freak," Victor said. "She's got an agenda. A few years back, she pushed out another family that lived here, convinced them to sell their house cheap by making their lives hell. Then, out of nowhere, a developer bought the property and turned it into one of those ugly modern things. Karen got a nice little referral fee out of the deal, or so I heard." Zach's mind reeled as he processed Victor's story. It all made sense now. Karen wasn't just harassing him for the sake of control, she was trying to force him out so she could profit from the sale of his property. His house, with its unique architecture and historical value, was likely worth far more to a developer than it was to him. If Karen could scare him into selling, she stood to make a fortune. Armed with this new perspective, Zach returned to Evelyn. Together, they began strategizing a way to not only stop Karen but expose her for the manipulative, money-hungry fraud she was. Zach's determination grew stronger with each passing day. Karen might have started this war, but Zach was going to finish it, and when he was done, she would regret ever setting foot on his property. Zach's battle against Karen had taken a sharp turn into dangerous territory. Her harassment was no longer just about annoying notes or threats. She was actively trying to dismantle his life. Every day brought a new challenge: mysterious deliveries he hadn't ordered, false claims of code violations, and contractors showing up with dubious orders to work on his property. Karen was escalating, and it was clear she had an endgame. Zach needed to figure out what it was and stop her before she caused any more damage. Evelyn, his lawyer, had been digging into Karen's background for weeks, and her findings painted a clear picture of a woman who thrived on control and manipulation. Karen's pattern was obvious. She would target homeowners who didn't conform to her vision of the neighborhood, drive them out through a combination of legal pressure and personal harassment, and then somehow profit from the sale of their property. Zach's house, with its historical value and prime location, was likely her biggest target yet. But uncovering her schemes wasn't enough. They needed solid proof, something that would expose her to the authorities and leave no room for denials. Zach installed additional security cameras, focusing on blind spots Karen's people had exploited before. He also set up motion sensors along the edges of his property and connected everything to his phone for real-time alerts. Evelyn advised him to document every interaction with Karen and her associates, no matter how small. The more evidence we have, the harder it will be for her to wiggle out of this, she told him. Zach followed her advice to the letter, keeping a detailed log of every incident and adding new footage to his growing file of evidence. It didn't take long for the cameras to catch something. Late one night, Zach was awakened by a notification on his phone. The motion sensors had detected activity near his driveway. He opened the live feed and saw two men in dark clothing unloading tools from a truck parked just outside his property. One of them carried a heavy-looking drill, while the other pulled a long measuring tape from his pocket. They worked quickly, moving along the perimeter of Zach's yard and marking the ground with spray paint. Zach immediately called the police, his heart pounding as he watched the intruders on his phone screen. He wasn't going to let them get away this time. By the time the officers arrived, the men had already packed up their tools and driven off, but Zach's cameras had captured everything: their faces, the license plate on the truck, and the markings they'd left behind. The officers took the footage and promised to investigate, but Zach could tell they weren't optimistic about catching the culprits. The next morning, Zach walked the perimeter of his property to inspect the damage. The spray-painted markings were still there, bright orange lines that seemed to outline sections of his yard. At first, Zach thought they were random, but as he followed the lines, he realized they formed a distinct pattern. They weren't just marking his property, they were carving out a specific section of it. His stomach sank as he realized what Karen was planning. Evelyn confirmed his suspicions later that day. "She's setting you up for a land dispute," she said grimly. "These markings are meant to suggest that part of your property belongs to someone else, probably the neighborhood or a developer she's working with. If she can get the local authorities to back her claim, you'll be forced into a legal battle over the boundaries of your own land. It's a classic tactic, and it's expensive to fight." Zach felt a surge of frustration and anger. He had inherited this house fair and square. The property lines were clearly defined in the deed, and he had all the paperwork to prove it. But Karen wasn't interested in the truth. She was banking on her ability to outmaneuver Zach with legal red tape and intimidation. Determined to stay one step ahead, Zach hired a professional surveyor to revalidate his property lines. The surveyor spent hours meticulously measuring every boundary, comparing the results to the official records Zach provided. When the report came back, it was exactly what Zach expected. The markings Karen's people had left were entirely within his property. There was no legal basis for her claims. But Zach knew that wasn't enough. Karen wouldn't stop until she was exposed, and he needed more than just a survey report to take her down. Evelyn suggested looking into Karen's financial dealings, suspecting that her connection to local developers was the key to unraveling her schemes. Zach agreed, and they hired a private investigator to dig deeper. The investigator, a no-nonsense woman named Lydia, quickly uncovered a web of questionable transactions. Karen had been receiving payments from a shell company linked to a prominent real estate developer. The payments were listed as consulting fees, but the amounts were far too large to be legitimate. Lydia also found emails between Karen and the developer discussing plans to revitalize the neighborhood. One email even mentioned Zach's house by address, with Karen suggesting that it would be a prime opportunity once the current owner was removed. When Zach read the emails, his hands shook with rage. This wasn't just about personal vendettas or neighborhood aesthetics. Karen had been plotting to steal his home from the start, working with a developer who wanted to tear it down and replace it with something generic and profitable. She had lied, cheated, and destroyed property to make it happen, all while hiding behind a facade of concern for the community. Evelyn was thrilled with the evidence Lydia had uncovered. "This is exactly what we needed," she said. "We have her on record, conspiring to defraud you and profit from the destruction of your property. Now we can take this to court and the authorities." But Zach wasn't ready to stop there. He wanted Karen to face the consequences of her actions, not just in court but in the community she had manipulated for so long. He reached out to a few of his neighbors, including Victor, the older man who had first told him about Karen's schemes. Together, they began organizing a neighborhood meeting to share what they had discovered. The meeting was held in Victor's backyard, away from Karen's prying eyes. Dozens of neighbors showed up, many of whom had their own stories of being harassed or manipulated by Karen. When Zach presented the evidence, Lydia's findings, the survey report, and the video footage from his cameras, the mood in the room shifted from frustration to outrage. "She's been doing this for years," one woman said, her voice trembling with anger. "I knew she was shady, but I had no idea it was this bad. She tried to do the same thing to me," another man added, "but I didn't have the resources to fight her, so I sold my house for half of what it was worth. I can't believe she's still getting away with this." Zach felt a flicker of hope as the neighbors rallied around him. For the first time since this ordeal began, he didn't feel alone. They all agreed to support him in his fight against Karen, signing a petition to present to local authorities and pledging to testify if necessary. The next step was taking Karen to court, armed with the overwhelming evidence of her corruption. But Zach knew that even with the support of his neighbors and Evelyn's legal expertise, the fight was far from over. Karen was cunning and ruthless, and she wouldn't go down without a fight. Still, as he walked back to his house that night, Zach felt a renewed sense of determination. This wasn't just about saving his home anymore. It was about standing up to a bully and reclaiming his community from the grip of greed and deceit. Zach knew the battle was about to escalate, but even he wasn't prepared for how far Karen was willing to go. The meeting with his neighbors had been a turning point. For the first time, Zach felt like he wasn't fighting this war alone. But Karen, as cunning and relentless as ever, clearly sensed the shift in momentum. Her retaliation was swift and vicious. Within days, Zach found himself under siege again, not just from Karen's usual harassment, but from new and unexpected fronts. It started with another letter, this time from the local building department. Zach received a notice informing him that his property was under investigation for unauthorized renovations. The letter claimed that several complaints had been filed, alleging that Zach's restoration work violated safety codes and endangered the structural integrity of his home. Zach stared at the notice, his frustration boiling over. This was Karen's handiwork, he had no doubt. She was using every tool at her disposal to tie him up in red tape, hoping to drown him in bureaucracy until he gave up. Evelyn's response was measured but firm. "They're playing dirty, Zach." But this isn't surprising. Karen knows she's running out of time, so she's throwing everything she has at you. The building department is just another pawn in her game. We'll respond with the necessary documentation and make it clear that these claims are baseless. Zach spent hours gathering permits, contractor reports, and any other paperwork that might prove his renovations were above board. But as he worked, the sense of unease grew. Karen wasn't just trying to discredit him, she was setting the stage for something bigger. His suspicions were confirmed a few nights later when he received another late-night notification from his security cameras. This time it wasn't trespassers or contractors, it was heavy machinery. Zach opened the live feed on his phone and saw a bulldozer parked just beyond his property line. Two men in reflective vests stood nearby, gesturing toward his house. Zach didn't hesitate. He called the police and then grabbed his jacket, determined to confront whoever was behind this latest intrusion. By the time Zach reached the edge of his property, the men were already retreating to their truck. He flagged them down, demanding an explanation. "What the hell are you doing on my property?" he shouted. One of the men, a stocky guy with a clipboard, gave Zach a dismissive shrug. "We're here on orders to clear this area for redevelopment. Got the paperwork right here." Zach snatched the clipboard and scanned the document. It was a demolition order, signed and dated, but the name listed as the property owner wasn't his. The document claimed the land had been sold to a developer just days earlier. Zach's blood ran cold as he realized what Karen was attempting. "This is my land," Zach said through gritted teeth, shoving the clipboard back at the man. "Your paperwork is fake, and if you set 1 foot on my property again, I'll have you arrested for trespassing." The men exchanged uncertain glances but eventually backed down, climbing into their truck and driving away. Zach stood in the dark, his fists clenched as he watched the taillights disappear. Karen wasn't just trying to scare him anymore, she was actively trying to erase him. The next day, Zach confronted Karen in front of her house. He didn't care about making a scene anymore. He wanted answers. Karen was outside pruning her hedges, her face a mask of calm as Zach approached. "You tried to demolish my house," Zach said, his voice trembling with rage. Karen set down her shears and turned to face him, her expression serene. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she said, feigning innocence. "Don't play dumb," Zach shot back. "I caught your guys on camera last night with a bulldozer and a fake demolition order. You're not even trying to hide it anymore." Karen smirked, her calm demeanor slipping for just a moment. If the land isn't properly maintained, sometimes things have to be done for the greater good. Maybe if you'd taken better care of your property, this wouldn't be an issue. Zach's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You're done, Karen. I've got enough evidence to bury you, and I'm not stopping until everyone knows exactly what kind of person you are." Karen's smirk widened. "Oh, Zach, you still don't understand, do you? You're fighting a battle you can't win. This neighborhood belongs to me. I've spent years building it into something worth preserving, and I'm not going to let you ruin it with your stubbornness. So go ahead, take me to court. Scream at the top of your lungs. It won't change anything." Zach turned and walked away, his heart pounding. Karen's arrogance was infuriating, but it only strengthened his resolve. If she thought she was untouchable, she was about to learn how wrong she was. Evelyn and Zach doubled down on their efforts to expose Karen. Lydia, the private investigator, continued digging into Karen's financial connections, uncovering even more damning evidence. One document revealed that Karen had been working with the developer for years, funneling money into secret accounts in exchange for her cooperation. Another showed that she had been lobbying the local government to rezone Zach's property, which would allow for commercial redevelopment and make his house worthless. But the most shocking discovery came from Victor, the elderly neighbor who had first warned Zach about Karen's schemes. Victor had stumbled upon an old letter addressed to Karen from the developer. In the letter, they discussed plans to acquire Zach's property by any means necessary, including using fabricated violations and forged documents. Victor handed the letter over to Zach, who immediately forwarded it to Evelyn. "This is the smoking gun," Evelyn said, her excitement palpable. "We've got her dead to rights. Not only has she been conspiring to defraud you, but she's also committed multiple crimes in the process: fraud, forgery, and abuse of power. Once we present this in court, she's finished." But Karen wasn't done yet. That weekend, Zach woke to find his driveway blocked by a massive pile of construction debris. Cement blocks, rusted metal, and broken wood were stacked haphazardly, making it impossible for him to leave. It was an obvious act of intimidation, and Zach wasted no time documenting the scene and calling the police. When the officers arrived, they took photos and filed a report, but their hands were tied without direct evidence linking Karen to the act. Zach felt his frustration mounting. Karen's ability to manipulate the system seemed endless, but he refused to back down. The final straw came when Zach discovered that someone had tampered with his security cameras. 2 of the cameras had been disabled, their wires cut cleanly, and the motion sensors on the backside of his property were smashed. Zach immediately called Evelyn, who advised him to hire additional security and document everything. "This isn't just harassment anymore," Evelyn said. "This is a coordinated attack. Karen's trying to push you to your breaking point, but you can't let her win. We're close to bringing her down, and she knows it." Zach spent the rest of the day repairing his cameras and reinforcing his property's boundaries. He was tired, angry, and emotionally drained, but he refused to let Karen break him. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, Zach felt like victory was within reach. He just had to hold on a little longer. The courtroom was packed. The tension in the air was almost tangible as Zach sat at the plaintiff's table with Evelyn by his side. Across the aisle sat Karen, dressed in a sharp gray suit, her expression unreadable. She radiated the same smug confidence Zach had grown to despise, but there was an unease in her eyes that she couldn't entirely hide. She knew this wasn't just another minor dispute that she could brush off with her usual tactics. This time, she was fighting for her reputation, her power, and potentially her freedom. Evelyn had spent weeks meticulously preparing their case, leaving no stone unturned. She had every piece of evidence lined up: the video footage of trespassers on Zach's property, the contractor's report detailing the intentional destruction of his living room wall, and the fraudulent demolition order Karen had orchestrated. Lydia's investigation into Karen's financial dealings was the linchpin of the case. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Karen had been working with the developer to drive Zach out and profit from the sale of his home. The proceedings began with Zach taking the stand. Evelyn led him through his testimony, allowing him to recount everything Karen had done, from the initial harassment to the damage to his property and the relentless attempts to intimidate him. Zach spoke with a calm but firm resolve, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. As he described the sleepless nights, the financial strain, and the constant feeling of being under siege, he could see the impact his words had on the jury. When it was Karen's turn to testify, she was her usual manipulative self, trying to portray Zach as an unreasonable neighbor who refused to follow community standards. She painted herself as a misunderstood advocate for the neighborhood, someone who only wanted what was best for everyone. But Evelyn was ready for her. During cross-examination, Evelyn dismantled Karen's facade piece by piece. She began with the financial records, presenting the jury with copies of the payments Karen had received from the developer. The courtroom grew tense as Evelyn displayed emails between Karen and the developer, highlighting their plan to remove obstacles like Zach's property. Karen's composure faltered as Evelyn pressed her on the source of these payments and the nature of her relationship with the developer. "I've done nothing illegal," Karen insisted, her voice tight with frustration. Evelyn didn't miss a beat. "You call falsifying demolition orders and hiring contractors to trespass on private property legal?" she asked, her voice razor sharp. She held up the forged demolition order, pointing to the discrepancies in the signatures. "This document alone is proof of your intent to defraud Mr. Miller." Karen tried to deflect, claiming ignorance, but Evelyn didn't let up. She moved on to the letter Victor had provided, the one where Karen and the developer openly discussed their plans to force Zach out. Karen's attempt to dismiss it as taken out of context fell flat, especially when Evelyn had Lydia testify about the broader pattern of corruption Karen had engaged in for years. The turning point came when Evelyn called Victor to the stand. The elderly neighbor recounted his own experiences with Karen, describing how she had harassed him and other residents to sell their homes below market value. He spoke about the fear and isolation she had instilled in the community, and how many had felt powerless to stand up to her. His testimony was heartfelt and damning, and it left little doubt about Karen's true character. As the trial reached its climax, Evelyn presented the final piece of evidence: video footage from Zach's security cameras showing the trespassers Karen had hired to spray paint fake property lines on his land. The jury watched intently as Evelyn tied every thread of the case together, illustrating how Karen's greed and malice had driven her to commit fraud, trespass, and harassment. In her closing argument, Evelyn didn't hold back. "This isn't just about one man's home," she said, her voice ringing through the courtroom. "It's about a pattern of abuse and corruption. Karen Bishop has spent years exploiting her position and manipulating those around her for personal gain. Today you have the power to hold her accountable, to send a message that no one is above the law, no matter how powerful or untouchable they believe themselves to be. The jury deliberated for hours, but when they finally returned, the verdict was clear. Karen was found guilty of fraud, harassment, and malicious destruction of property. The judge ordered her to pay Zach $500,000 in damages, a sum that would cover the repairs to his home and compensate him for the emotional and financial toll her actions had taken. Karen's expression was a mixture of shock and fury as the judge delivered the sentence. For once, she was speechless. Zach watched her, feeling a sense of vindication wash over him. It wasn't just about the money, it was about reclaiming his life and proving that she couldn't bully or intimidate him into submission. As the courtroom emptied, neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak up approached Zach, offering their congratulations and support. Victor patted him on the shoulder, a proud smile on his face. "You did it, kid," he said. "You stood up to her, and you won." But Zach knew this wasn't just his victory. It was a victory for everyone Karen had tried to manipulate and intimidate. She had been exposed, her power stripped away, and the neighborhood could finally begin to heal from the damage she had caused. Walking out of the courthouse, Zach took a deep breath of the crisp afternoon air. For the first time in months, he felt free. Karen's reign of terror was over, and his house, the home his grandmother had loved so dearly, was finally safe. Now it was time to rebuild not just the house, but his life, and this time no one was going to take it away from him. The weeks following the trial felt surreal to Zach. The storm of chaos that Karen had unleashed on his life had finally come to an end. The courtroom victory wasn't just a legal win, it was a personal triumph that validated every sleepless night, every moment of doubt, and every ounce of resolve he had poured into fighting back. Karen's defeat sent shockwaves through the neighborhood, and the carefully constructed image she had cultivated for years crumbled almost overnight. Her smug facade was gone, replaced by a shadow of her former self, as she scrambled to repair the damage to her reputation. But it was too late. Word of the trial and her fraudulent schemes had spread far beyond the neighborhood, and even those who had once supported her turned their backs. No one wanted to be associated with someone who had manipulated, harassed, and profited at the expense of their own community. Karen was forced to sell her home and move away. Zach didn't know where she went, and he didn't care. Her departure felt like the final chapter closing on a long and painful ordeal. With Karen gone, the neighborhood began to feel lighter, freer. Neighbors who had once been wary of speaking out against her were now coming together, sharing their stories and reclaiming their sense of community. For Zach, the $500,000 in damages was more than just a financial windfall, it was a chance to restore his home and his peace of mind. He immediately got to work repairing the destruction Karen had caused. With the help of skilled contractors and his own expertise, Zach rebuilt the living room walls, restored the original wood paneling, and reinforced the structural integrity of the house. Each piece of wood he sanded and stained felt like reclaiming a part of his grandmother's legacy. But Zach didn't stop at repairing the damage. He decided to honor the house's history in a way that would bring people together. He transformed one of the spacious ground floor rooms into a small gallery, showcasing not only his own handcrafted furniture, but also artifacts from the home's past, old photographs, antique tools, and pieces of the original architecture that told the story of its Victorian roots. When the renovations were finally complete, Zach threw a celebration. He invited the entire neighborhood to see the house restored to its former glory. The gallery became a centerpiece of the gathering, drawing neighbors in with its warmth and history. As Zach walked through the house that evening, hearing laughter and conversation fill the rooms, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. His home wasn't just a house anymore, it was a symbol of resilience and community. Victor, his older neighbor and one of his staunchest supporters throughout the ordeal, raised a glass during the gathering. To Zach, he said, his voice strong despite his years, "For standing up when the rest of us couldn't, for showing us that no bully, no matter how powerful, can take what's ours if we fight for it." The room erupted into cheers and applause, and Zach felt a warmth spread through him. For so long, the house had been a battleground. Now it was a sanctuary again, a place where he could live, create, and thrive. In the weeks that followed, neighbors began to come to Zach for advice, not just about woodwork or home repairs, but about how to stand up for themselves. They wanted to know how he had kept going when things seemed impossible, and Zach was happy to share his experience. He had learned the hard way that perseverance and community support could overcome even the most insurmountable challenges. Looking out at his restored yard one crisp morning, Zach allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The house, the neighborhood, and even his own life had been tested to their limits, but they had endured. Karen was gone, her schemes exposed, and the scars she had left behind were already beginning to heal. Zach took a deep breath and smiled. The fight was over, and he had won not just for himself, but for everyone she had tried to trample over. The house stood as it always had, weathered but proud, a monument to the past and a promise for the future. And Zach knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, this was a place where he could finally build a life worth living, surrounded by people who believed in him and the values he had fought so hard to protect.